Understanding the multidimensional universe of the Vedas. This presentation follows on from others of mine, especially Astronomy of the Bhagavat Purana and the Vedic universe and sacred geometry, so please see them first if you can. Now, the ancient Vedic approach to reality treats aspects of the same object as being equally real, regardless of scale. For example, now, if you closely study the leaf, you'll see its cells. If you step back from such details, you'll see the leaf. And if you step back more, you'll see the tree, the forest, the jungle, and so on. Now, which of these perceptions is the most real? Now, that depends really on one's senses and what one decides and one is able to tune into. This is reflected in the fifth part of the Bhagavat Purana, or the Srimad Bhagavatam, where different references to ancient Greater India, the Earth plane, and our solar system are described in the same set of verses, based on different senses and perception. In modern science, the universe as a whole is essentially an extremely large physical entity, whereas the Vedas treats that large parts of the universe are hidden from us due to our limited senses, limited when compared with the perception of the celestial beings. The universe is ultimately hierarchical, like human institutions or networks. The details of what one sees increases as you move down, but the scope also gets smaller. Vedic observations of reality are made by different forms of God and other divine beings. For example, to Mahavishnu, each universe resembles a tiny bubble coming from the pores of his skin, lasting for one breath. The high demigods see the individual universe more closely. Other ones see it a little closer still. We earthbound humans see the universe according to our limited sensual experience. Then apes, for example, and lower animals have their worlds, as do insects, of course. For example, what a fly perceives is very different to what we perceive. Different viewpoints are due to differences in senses and time, like bodily senses, experience of time, but also levels of consciousness, and they're all interconnected. So considering the physical distances between planets alone is not all that relevant. In fact, it's one factor amongst other ways of measuring, and this is actually non-applicable. True distances depends on one's level of consciousness and how they are related to each other. For example, a mother and a child may be physically close to each other, but the mother cannot deliver much academic knowledge to her child at the time, but another adult who is physically further away connects more because of having a similar mental capacity. Understanding this point is necessary to help us grasp the multidimensional universe. As a whole, it can't be experienced just in terms of physical distance. There are other types of distances to consider. Now, this disproportionate grid represents how a physical more distant object can actually be further in other terms. These arrows also represent that. I really like this image too, showing how the bending of space-time can affect how distance is experienced. The universe as a cosmic tree. Unlike the modern conception, often the Vedas describes this universe as being structured by like a multi-dimensional upside-down tree. In creation, the trunk comes first, and then the branches, and so on. In this tree, subtle forms are made of mind, intelligence, and ego come first. Then, as the creation proceeds further, physical gross matter comes. Therefore, the path by which something is created remains invisible to those lower down the creation path, into the smaller branches. Let's close in a bit on something familiar. Here's the Earth, and here's the Moon. For one to go from one planetary body to another, one must use the branches of the tree model, like this. In Vedic terms, we cannot fly in a straight physical line because there's no route via the branches. The universe just isn't designed like that. Now, space agencies may send probes to the Moon or elsewhere in the solar system, but these agencies will only receive information detected by the instruments installed on those probes. So in this multi-dimensional universe, real space travel for conscious beings has to be based on what we would call non-linear factors. In other words, there's a distant difference between the bright celestial moon and the shadow moon seen during a solar eclipse, which is called Rahu. The two realms effectively occupy the same physical area. Although most people today believe the moon to be a dusty grey place, those with spiritual senses know it is also a heavenly realm. It's a bit like comparing a three-dimensional object with its two-dimensional version. The vertical aspect of this multi-dimensional universe. The Bhagavatam summarizes the cosmos. There are innumerable universes. Each is surrounded by a series of huge elemental layers, and in the center of these layers is a sphere, which contains all the different elements. It's divided into two halves. The central horizontal axis of the sphere is 4 billion miles in diameter. That is called Bhumandala, essentially a flat disk in space. It fits in very nicely indeed with our solar system, with the Earth at its center. This is the inner section of Bhumandala solar system. Note it's quite flat. The vertical axis of this universe is said to include 14 planetary levels. This direction extends only 2 billion miles altogether, yet it includes innumerable stars. In modern astronomy, all stars are much, much further away than a mere 2 billion miles. But a physical distance is not intended, I suggest. There are even more modern scientific models like that, based on the observable universe. For example, this represents the entire universe, where a proportional distance between the Earth and the edge of the observable universe is not intended. This geocentric image shows a logarithmic scale, where each point along its radius represents 10 times further than the previous node. Meanwhile, one goes back in time. This geometric pattern represents a similar concept. As one gets closer to the edge, the scale simply gets smaller. So very distant stars are in some way accessible within only 2 billion miles. Let's dig deeper. From a physical point of view, all the different types of planets and stars in this universe are mixed like this. But in the Bhagavatam, the same planetary bodies are stacked according to a spiritual hierarchy, with specific vertical heights above Bhumandala. The higher the planet, the higher the consciousness of its inhabitants. This hierarchy actually resembles the human bodily chakras. Note that the Bhagavatam and the Surasiddhanta scriptures are not naive about the physical distances as described in modern astronomy. However, the Bhagavatam also describes heavenly realms which are accessible from the earth. Together, they're called Jambudvip, not seen by humans of today. At Jambudvip's center is a huge sacred mountain called Mount Meru. Where the celestial beings travel from the earth to higher planets, they first pass by Meru. In that way, they reach the sun before the celestial moon. This is because the celestial moon, called Chandraloka, is a high-ranking heavenly realm. It's worth mentioning that the universe also includes planets with inhabitants that are spiritually inferior to us. They are ranked underneath us vertically, like this. Taking a step back there and having a look at it from a distance. Heavenly planets with exotic oceans. According to the Bhagavatam, along the horizontal axis of Bhumandala, there are realms with heavenly attributes, mountains, a variety of exotic oceans with cultured populations. In Bhaktivedanta Swami's commentary on the 7th canto, 417, he writes, "Planets within the universe contain oceans of sugarcane juice, liquor, ghee, milk, and sweet water. These substances are the nearest to local equivalents to the oceans on those planets, and they're all presented as part of Bhumandala. But we can't see them, so where are these realms? This is what I suggest. Note this is Mount Meru as mentioned before. Around Mount Meru is Bhumandala. Let me support the idea that these heavenly planets have substantial heights above Bhumandala. Note this is Bhumandala from the top, with the golden coloured Mount Meru in its centre. This is the Shi Yantra, which can also represent the universe. The three-dimensional version of this yantra is called Maha Meru. has Mount Meru at its top centre. It's like a three-dimensional representation of Bhumandala itself. Now, although Bhumandala interpreted as the solar system is quite flat, the rings around Mahameru have various heights. Also note these illustrations, improved by Hindu Vaishnav scholars, seem to contain the same principle. So there's a reason to believe that planets with exotic oceans are in different parts of the universe and not physically within our local solar system. After all, the levels of Mahameru's rings can represent progressive steps in spiritual advancement for the devotees. This image of the Vedic universe shows where the planets and stars are categorized. For example, a heavenly world here, placed some million miles above Venus, indicates its distance when travelling from that region in a multidimensional way. Same applies across the inner solar system. To put it another way, for example, in this graph the horizontal axis represents the physical distance in space, and the vertical axis represents higher dimensional distance, and here's the Earth. Let's for example put the planet Venus as modern science experiences. It's a hellishly hot place, and it's only slightly above Bhumandala, but its main attribute is its physical distance from the Earth. It's nearby in cosmic terms. Now here's a heavenly planet which has a relationship with the location of Venus. The planet's higher category, however, means that some type of spacecraft is necessary there to reach the Earth, but it would require to travel both in physical and high dimensional ways in order to experience that heavenly world. Bhumandala also includes realms like Plakshadweep. I'll place it here, physically not all that far from the Earth, but in a considerably higher dimension. So we can't perceive it at all with our mundane five senses, but it's nevertheless. Remember those two versions of the moon I mentioned earlier? We can represent them here on the same graph. So in conclusion, in this presentation I have attempted to explain how the Vedic universe is not restricted by the laws that we experience, rather it's more like a hierarchical tree. And the Bhagavatam's description of the planetary systems is an accurate summary of the universe from the experience of the celestial beings. I hope you've enjoyed that presentation, and please see my others previously, and please feel welcome to get in touch with any questions, comments and so forth.